So in this video, we'll be implementing the filter function, so filtering by class and section. So what we want to do here is we want to display all of the classes available in our database. So for that, what we need to do is we need to query the classes table and display the classes using for each loop. So let's define the routes and all the necessary things that we need to do. So let's go ahead and do that. So for that, let's open up our Visual Studio Code. And let's go ahead, and in order to display these classes, let's go ahead to our api.php and let's define a new route with classes, and we have classes controller, and we need to go to the index. So let's go ahead to the classes controller, go to the, let's create a function called index, and here let's define the resource for class as well. So API resource for class, so PHP artisan make resource classes resource. That's done. Let's go to this, and okay, we don't need to do anything here. So now let's query all of the classes. So classes all, and return classes resource collection classes. Let's save that. Now let's go to the, okay, let's go ahead and check that in our browser. So if I go ahead and type in classes, then we should get all of the classes. So we need to call the API and then classes. So we are getting all the classes here. So let's go ahead in our students index.view and let's define a new property called classes, which will be empty by default. And what we want to do is on the mounted function, we will be calling the axios.get to /API/classes, and then what we are gonna do here is we'll be receiving the response, and what we want to do here is assign the receive values to these classes. So that will be response.data.data. Let's save that, and if we go ahead and reload our browser, check the view tab, we have classes and the object is empty. Why is that? So mounted, we are calling the API/classes, then response. Okay, let's console.log the response. So we are getting data.data. We have array of 5. Okay, it's working fine. Actually, it took a bit of time to load that. So again, if you go ahead and reload, and as you can see, we have 5 arrays with their respective values. So now what we can do is, since we have these classes, let's go ahead in our select tag for classes and let's loop through each of these. So option v4 class in classes, and we also need to call the key here. So the key will be class.id, and okay, we are still getting this error. I don't know why. Unexpected keyword. Okay, let's remove that keyword and keep that as item, v4 item in classes. And okay, we also need to change that to item. The value will be item.id, and we need to bind that, and the actual output should be item.name. So let's save that and go ahead and reload our browser. Everything should work as expected. So yes, it takes a bit of time to make that API request. So now we have class 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we also need to define one more property, that is the selected class. So if I go ahead and select class 1, then I want to wire model, not wire model, but v model this to a certain property, so that I should know which class has been selected, and then depending on that I would query the sections table. So for that, let's go ahead to our students index view and define one more property, that is selected class, and this will be null by default. And let's v-model this in our option tag. So we have that here. So select, we model this with the selected class. And now if I go ahead and reload my browser, pull this up, student index, we have selected class is null. And if I select class 1, then as you can see, we have selected class as ID. Since we have the value of ID, of class ID, according to that we get the value assigned to this selected class. And we also need to define a watcher. So whenever I change that selected class, so whenever that selected class changes, then I want to make a query, or I want to execute a function. So here let's define this watcher for selected class, and we have a function which is going to receive the value. And here also we are going to call the get students property, since whenever any value changes, whenever the value of the selected class changes, then we want to query the get students, then we want to query the database and get all the students belonging to that certain class. So I hope you get the idea. And now what we will be doing here is I'll send another query parameter of selected class, and this will be this selected class. So I'll be implementing this first, and then it will be same for the selected section as well. So let's save that. And now we have this selected class value in our student controller. So here we have the selected class, which will be request selected class. And now what we can do is, whenever there's a value, so we can actually append when. So whenever a certain value is set, so if this selected class value has a certain value, selected class variable has a certain value, then we will be querying the database. So we can actually pass the when condition parameter here, when conditional clause. So whenever a certain value like selected class is set, then we want to execute that query. So here what we'll be doing is we'll be passing that selected class value. So when this selected class is set, then we want to call a function which is gonna get the parameter called query. And we also need to use the selected class, since we'll be using that selected class to query our database. And here we need to wrap this inside brackets, and we'll be executing the function where we'll be using the query and use the where clause here, where the class ID. So here we are inside the students model, students table, and we'll be querying the database where the class ID is equal to this selected class. Okay, and since we are here, what we can also do is let's copy this selected class and define the same for the selected section as well. And in here we can duplicate this query, and when the selected section is set, then what we want to do is we also need to query the section ID. So where the section ID is this selected section, And now let's go to our browser and reload. Okay, we have an error here and we don't see any error here, but we probably need to debug what's going on. And the reason we are not getting any data here is because since we have a selected class of null, so what we can do here is instead of passing a null value, let's pass an empty string. So now it should work. I don't really know the exact reason for this, but this will pass an empty string to the API request here. So this will be an empty string, and in our student controller, this will be set to null. Maybe that's the mechanism that's going on here. So now if we go ahead and reload our browser, everything should work as expected. So now we need to implement the dependent dropdown. So when I select class 1, then I should see the sections of class 1. Yeah, I should see the sections of class 1. So let's go ahead and in our students index.view, what we are doing is we are watching for the selected class. That means let's also define a new property called selected section that will be empty by default, and also define a new property called sections which will be empty by default. So since we have defined these two properties, we also need to create an API to make the request to the sections. So we need to define sections. So we want to get all the sections of a specific class, and let's go to sections controller index. So we have that sections controller. Okay, we don't have, maybe we have section controller. So that's inside section controller. Okay, for some reason this is not working. So go to the section controller and define a function called index, and we can get the class ID using the request object. So let's define as class ID, and we want to get all the sections where the class ID is this class ID. Let's get these and let's return. Okay, let's also define a API resource for sections resource. So we have that, and we don't need to do anything here as well. So we'll just return sections resource collection with these sections. Save that, and we need to make API call from the view part. So for that, so on change of a selected class, what I want to do here is, okay, since we have in the get students, so what we can do here is we'll be passing the selected section as well. So did we do the vModel part? Maybe we didn't. Okay, we need to make the API request to get all the section first, and then we'll do the vModel part later. So whenever the selected class changes, then I wanna make a Axios request to /API/sections, and I also need to pass the class ID. So that will be class. Okay, we don't need the and here. We can actually send the class ID like this with a question mark, will be equal to this dot selected class, and then we get a response where I want to store those in my sections property, which will be inside response.data.data. Let's save that. And on the section controller, so we have index. So this will, so whenever we hit this API route, so /API says sections, and with the value of class ID is this selected class, then we hit this api.php on the API/section, which will go to section controller at their index function. And inside section controller, what we are doing is we are grabbing the class ID. So if there's nothing, let's keep that to null. And we want to get the sections where the class ID is this class ID and get. And then we are returning a section resource collection with these sections. And then what we are doing is on the students index.view, we are assigning those values to the sections property. Now, if we go ahead and reload our browser and let's inspect the students index. So for now, we have sections object as empty. And when I go ahead and change that to class 2, then we have selected class as 2 and we have selected section as empty. But okay, we also have the sections as empty. That shouldn't be the case. Selected section is empty. Okay, that's fine. But we have sections. So let's debug what's actually happening. So we are getting axios.get API/sections where class ID is this selected class. And then we get the response. So let's console.log the response. Save that. And let's check out our console. So if I select class 4, then we are getting a 500 internal server error. So API/sections (class ID equal to 4 500 internal server error, request failed. So I had an import error on my api.php. I didn't import the section controller, so for that I was getting an error. So what I did was, in order to debug this, what I did was in our students index, I made a call to /API/sections with the class ID of this selected class, and the response, I just console.log the response. And in this section controller, in order to check whether I was getting the correct class ID or not, I just return the class ID. And now if I go ahead and reload the browser and select class 1, then I should see data with the value of 1 here. So this is now actually working fine. So I just properly imported the section controller in my api.php. Now what we can actually do is, instead of returning the class ID, we can query the sections and then return the sections. And on the students index.view, instead of console logging this, what we can do is we can assign these values to the sections. So save that, and once again reload the browser. Now if we go ahead and check the view tab, on the students index, we have empty object for sections. So if I go ahead and check the class 2, then we get two arrays, two items for sections. So one is section A and the another one is, where's that? So section B. So now what we can do is we can loop through these in our select tag for sections. So let's loop through option V for section. In sections, we need to pass the key as section.id. the value will be, so we need to bind this. The value will be section dot id, and in order to display the actual value, what we need to do here is we need the section dot name. So let's save that, and again go ahead and reload our browser. So select class 2. Then as you can see, we have section A and B for class 3. So one more thing that we can do here is, if we don't select any class, then we can actually hide this. So if we don't have any selected class, I think this should work fine. So if the selected class has a certain value, then we want to show this whole div, otherwise we'll be hiding it. So save that and reload our browser. So now we are only seeing the filter by class option. If I go ahead and select class 2, then we see the option for section. So if we can now again select the section in order to filter by section. So let's do one more thing. Let's v-model this to the selected section. So we have already defined the selected section property here. So this is in order to filter the student by class and section. So once the student select a certain section, then we will be watching this selected section property, and depending on that, we'll be making API request. So we have defined the selected section property in the data. So let's watch for the selected section. So this will be similar to the selected class, but so this will be selected section, and this will execute a function which is going to receive a value which we don't need. So here what we are going to do is we are only going to run the get student property, and inside get student, what we'll be doing is we'll be passing the selected section. So the selected section will be this selected section, and this will go to the student controller, and here we have selected section where we'll be getting the value through the request object. And when this value is selected, then we want to query our database, our students table, where the section ID is this selected section. So now everything should work as expected. So if I go ahead and select class 1, then all the students belonging to class 1 are displayed, and we don't have any student belonging to section B. So if I select section A, then all the data should be retained, and if I go ahead and select section B, then we should get an empty array. So yeah, this one's working fine. So this much for this video, and I hope you like the content. And in the next one, we'll be talking about the multi-select feature. So selecting multiple records and deleting these records, so bulk delete and single delete, and also showing a toaster notification that the records were deleted. So all those features we'll be discussing in the next one. So stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next one.